Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll start this discussion with the words of a rather influential individual, Pope Francis. In his recent encyclical, he wrote, "If present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate change and on an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for all of us." It's Pope Francis. In this legislation, the appropriation bill, there are numerous efforts to deny the reality of climate change. And specifically, what I want to deal with this amendment is the Executive Order 13693, Planning for Federal Sustainability in the Next Decade. The intention of this amendment is to support the federal government's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% over the next decade relative to 2008. This bill will save taxpayers money, about $18 billion, in avoided energy costs, and increase the share of electricity the federal government consumes from renewable resources by up to 30%. 26 million metric tons of greenhouse gases would be eliminated. So why, in the face of all of the scientific evidence, in the face of the reality that the climate is indeed changing, when we have throughout the state of California and around the nation, local governments planning for the eventuality, not the reality, of higher sea level, why would we put forth a bill that would prohibit the federal government from planning climate change? Let me just cite some of the ways in which the current legislation, this proposal, deals with it. It prohibits federal funds for any rulemaking or guidance with regard to the social cost of climate. Prohibits the EPA from limiting carbon pollution from new and renovated power plants, and there's been much discussion about that on the floor today. Prohibits the funding to update and revise the EPA's ozone standards. Prohibits funding for any change to status of HFCs, these are fluorocarbons, and prohibits the reporting detailing the federal funding for domestic and international climate change programs. Denial, denial, denial about what is really happening. My amendment would simply say that all of these provisions in the current bill, there's no money to carry out those provisions. It's really time for all of us here to recognize that there is a serious challenge. And it's one that Pope Francis points out so clearly. With that, I reserve my remaining time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Climate change is winning the amendment contest tonight. We've had a number of amendments on that subject. Earlier, we debated whether or not to continue a bipartisan reporting requirement in the bill on climate change expenditures. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanted to remove that requirement, which would have reduced transparency. Now my friend wants to ensure that funds being expended on climate and efficiency executive orders issued by the President. So I'm left to wonder whether my colleagues would prefer to know if the funds are spent on these programs or not. Regardless, this amendment certainly is unnecessary. The President did not consult Congress on these executive orders. So if anything, we should defund these programs until Congress can have an appropriate policy debate. I see no reason to include this language and urge my colleagues to vote no.
Does the gentleman reserve?
And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman. The executive order by the President is very straightforward. It basically says that the federal government shall reduce greenhouse gases, and he's using his appropriate authority as the administrative agent of our government to find ways to do that. And certain goals are set in the executive order. For example, reducing greenhouse gases by 40% over the next decade. What could be wrong with that when you save $18 billion in the process? And create more opportunities for renewable energy by up to 30%. So why would we pass a bill in this appropriation bill that would go exactly the opposite direction, that would actually create greater greenhouse gases and lead more directly and more imminently to the climate crisis? I fail to understand why we would want to take up a piece of legislation that has so many provisions in it that deny the reality of climate change, that put this government on the course to spend more money on programs that actually create a crisis that will be extraordinarily expensive. So I ask for an aye vote on this amendment, which would maintain the President's executive order and keep America on a path that all the world should carry out. And pay attention to what Pope Francis said. If present trends continue, this century may well witness extraordinary climate change and an unprecedented destruction of ecosystems with serious consequences for all of us. This is not something we should deny. This is something we should, in fact, pay attention to, and we ought to be able to maintain the President's executive order. With that, I yield back my remaining time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
The President did make his unilateral determination in an executive order. We have our opportunity to vote no on this amendment. I urge a no vote. Thank you. And I yield back to balance.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18,